This ramble is vaguely inspired by a mathematician's lament. In this essay, a mathematician laments the current state of mathematics education in his country. I believe it's USA, but it's certainly applicable to many, many other countries. The author argues that the exceedingly rigid, hyper-focused, soulless teaching of quote-unquote mathematics up to and including high school is a recipe for a majority of people detesting the discipline, losing potential individuals that would otherwise love the discipline and not just loving it but being productive in that field, but also negating the enjoyment and fascination of that discipline to an even larger population that will, at the very least, get it when taught the real deal, what mathematics truly is. It has been difficult to articulate what I'm going to try to sketch here now, grouping all this behavior together and pin down exactly what I find so uncomfortable about it. You have probably seen it in the online forums where they discuss narrative in any form, novels, movies, even video games. But here, I'll focus on novels, on books, and particularly in the ones that one is supposed to read for enjoyment. I don't pretend to know how far back this trend goes, but I'm sure it wasn't there when I was doing my formal education in high school. You will hear or read things like, well, is the plot tight, as to try to evaluate the value of a work, of a series? What about the character growth? How does this author do the growth of a character or a character arc? Then we go to something that is revealing. We hear many terms thrown. This is using a MacGuffin. This is a trope. It's just a deus ex machina and a barrage of terms. And they are terms that are not used from a deep understanding, not of the meaning of the term, and not from how they work. They seem to be used exclusively to put a stamp of validity on one's opinion, which is an issue with framing. This is my opinion, so let me use this bundle of officially sounding terms to validate my opinion without any further examination of how these terms work or their precise meaning. For series, of course, where does the second act starts? Where? In which book? How does the first act ends? And the gem, because that's what it is. How does insert author's name? How does this author writes a hero's journey? How is their hero's journey? With the implication that anyone that picks up a piece of paper or starts to write must be doing a hero's journey. Now think for a second the set of very rigid rules that all this implies. Imagine a book in which there's no pretense that the plot has to be tight. You have been transported to this very mysterious place that precedes history. For all we know, it is prehistory. You have been transported here. What would you like to do there? Would you like to go to the point from point A, where you were transported, to point B and get on with your quest? Or would you like to frolic around and just look at things, hear how people interact, what they say, how the social structures in that prehistory works? Imagine a book that dares doing that doesn't concern itself with rigid limitations of the plot must be tight, so we need to get from point 1 to point 2 efficiently. Who cares about efficiency? And then the other terms are just frustrating. What about arcs? Well, what if the story I want to tell cannot be cut down into 3 arcs? And then talking about first, second, and third arc is meaningless, because the narrative elements in there are not even in correspondence to what we usually cut into pieces to be mapped into these 3 arcs. And the hero's journey, that seems to be the strongest, the most stringent limitation. If the hero's journey catches many of the stories that we read, particularly in fantasy, in science fiction, and a lot of narrative schemes, what if that's not what I'm going for? Imagine a series that doesn't concern itself with mapping any one hero's arc. To me, these are the symptoms of a subculture that has internalized what I will call the mass production of narrative. It all begins with patterns. It makes sense. We humans are pattern-seeking animals. That's what we do. We seek patterns, structures. That's natural. That's how we work. If one wishes to study narrative, one reads a lot of narrative works, one studies fiction, and then one tries to find patterns, see how the patterns interact, segregate those patterns into those from one canon, from one tradition, and those from another one. Common points, the effect these patterns have on those that read. Obviously, categories emerge. Classifications exist. The problem is that there is a time when we get to templates. Now, there's nothing wrong with templates, not in principle. The problem is the next step. A template that is successful needs to be flexible enough to describe a broad variety of works within a tradition. A template is useful. It's useful for many reasons. For an author, I have no idea how they are useful. I don't write, at least not creatively. But for the critic, which I read, and for the reader, which I am, they are kind of useful. It allows one to describe things without too many words, to analyze things, and even for us readers, they allow us to select what we want to read. If there's a certain template and I want to read something like that, well, then it's useful to have a name for that template. But there's such a thing as a template that is way too successful. And this is why. Since the template works, and it has to work for this to make any sense, the template gains notoriety. From notoriety comes hegemony. And inevitably, from hegemony, you get normativity. And it is here where I have an issue. When one goes from this is how a novel might be, we get all the way to this is how a novel should be. All of a sudden, we go from how something can be a structure to anything that deviates from this structure is not just different. No, it is poorly written or ignorant, or the author doesn't know what they are doing. So the argument goes. The problem is that in essence, I see the art of narrative. I see narrative as an art. And for me, an art needs to be challenging what is conceivable, what one could expect. True art needs to happen on that boundary between what is known and what one cannot imagine that could happen. So to synthesize all this rambling, this first part of the rambling, this process turns narrative and books, at least fiction, it transforms something that is supposed to be a form of art into a manufactured, consumable good. Now, this might be a bit abstract. Let's be a bit more concrete. Narrative form writing, format, the modern novel. This set of expectations or rigid limits I'm talking about. First, there must be one character or a small group of characters that we can easily define as the protagonist. It is their story. It is about them. These protagonists need to be likable. We need to be able to root for them. We need to project ourselves into them and wish for them to be successful, to achieve their goals, to arrive to what they hope for. There must be bad guys. This is not gender. It doesn't matter if they're guys or not, it's just easier to refer to them as that. And they better be fun to hate. So, no nuance behind them. Well, maybe a bit, but not a lot, because it must be fun to hate them. It must be easy to hate them. And if we don't understand them, if there's no complexity behind them, all the better. The characters must grow, must change. There is an implicit bias in the term. Growth implies that they are getting better in some form. This implies that the arc has to be positive in a very specific way. Next, we had the fact that the plot is king. The story is the plot. So the argument goes. Characters are just vehicles to explore the plot, to advance the plot. And of course, the themes are just an oddity for the nerds in the group to talk about. Back to structure. The plot must have a very precise structure. First arc, second arc, and third arc, also called acts. And this must have very precise elements in them. Resolutions have to be climatic. going back to the same point, there must be resolution. And going deeper into all of these points, the underlying point seems to be the novel must cater to our expectations. Never, ever even hint at us revising what we expect. Challenge the way we think. And so we arrive to the subject of this apology. No, not that meaning. Apology is polysemic, and I'm using the less used definition for apology. The Kharkanas trilogy is truly a creative risk. That's even the case if we consider Malasan fans. Already in the prelude, a careful reader will decipher what Gallen is talking about and realize that it's essentially Erickson donning the ropes of Gallen, shamelessly breaking the proverbial fourth wall to let us know, to foreshadow what the series is going to be about. Your expectations will be challenged. I will demand a lot from you. And that's because I think it's worth it. But obviously, the judgment, I leave it to you. That's what I interpret Erickson is saying through Blind Gallen. You came here to learn more about the guy with the big awesome sword. This is not his story. This is not about him. You want answers about how the cosmological foundation of the Malasan universe is, what it is. You want to see the metaphysical foundations of magic being laid. But that defeats the entire point of the Book of the Fallen and of the book itself. And here I have to quote, "No, better discard me entire if peace of mind is desired." This is not a comforting read, particularly for us that already read 3.2 something like that million words of the Book of the Fallen establishing what the canon is. Metafiction. Kharkanas is more metafictional, more overtly metafictional than the Book of the Fallen was at any point. Again, the breaking of the fourth wall. It's a term I'm stealing from theater because I don't know what the term will be in the written novel, but the framing is a breaking of the fourth wall. We have Gallen. Well, what is Kharkanas? Kharkanas is an old poet, a guy who happens to be blind, narrating something to a bard, Fisher Keltath. He's very upfront about it. What I don't know, I shall invent. Completely upfront, unlike our buddy Kamensut. So what do we notice in Kharkanas at first read? The first thing is, besides this framing, that for some reason a lot of people miss, and I don't blame them for it, because it might be hard to take this at face value. It can happen. But first element, the prose. It's a style that is at times more verse than prose, actually. It feels ancient, but it hits the sweet spot between something that feels ancient and something that is sufficiently modernized as to be digestible. That balance cannot be easy to find. If you go back and read ancient books, ancient novels, they tend to age pretty badly in terms of style. So finding that sweet spot, that must be really hard. Kharkanas is then written by someone unafraid of reaching back into the far past and bringing elements that he believes are worth it, that are useful. If obviously need to be adapted, but that's it, they are still useful. I don't know if the style was pursued for its own sake. I mean, I wouldn't doubt it. If you have read the deconstruction series wherein Erickson essentially deconstructs his own prose, you will find that the man is a craftsman of narrative. It is completely a possibility that he's doing this exercise with the style just because the guy is a nerd of style, of stylistic craftsmanship. That's a possibility. I don't know about that, I'm not a writer, but what I know is the effect. One gets an overwhelming sense of atmosphere. And I've talked about this before because it applies to music too. I essentially group music into large sets. One that is, so to speak, active. The other one is more ambient or atmospheric. It doesn't try to explicitly tell you something. It tries to induce an emotional state or an atmospheric setting. And this is one of the things one gets from the style in Kharkanas. Soon after we notice this atmosphere, next thing that jumps to the eye is the tone. It's an ominous tone, as ominous as anything I've read in the Malasan cycle. Something is going to go terribly wrong. You know it from the tone, but also you know it because you read the Book of the Fallen. You know that shit hits the fan in this time period. The tone is oppressive. You feel it from the beginning if you read carefully. And in a way, it propels you to keep reading. Well, what are the details of this that is going to happen? If not so much the details, but how does it get to happen? And what is the point with it happening? Which is the more thematic approach. Now imagine having to write a novel while giving away the big twist up front. I suppose it happens a lot with prequels. But it's more limited than in this case, because we have very precise elements that are revealed in the Book of the Fallen about how bad things go here. But imagine an author that is not worried about the fact that you have been spoiled the twists, because apparently he knows that it is not the twist itself, but how it is executed that is interesting to the reader. To some of us, at least. And now that I think of it, there is an author that reveals twists not in the first couple of paragraphs, but in the titles. But I'm not going into Latin American literature right now. The point is that, you can give away the major plot twist and still make an extremely fun and compelling story. It's not about the twist itself, but about how it is executed and what it implies eventually. Then we leave behind Forge of Darkness and we go into Full of Light. Then serendipity strikes and we realize this series has no protagonist. Not one, not a small group. This novel doesn't seem to be about any one character. If anything, it seems to be about a civilization that is falling to pieces, soon to become many civilizations. Or maybe about civilizations from the beginning, because we have different ones in any case. Some are clashing with one another. Some are just falling into oblivion. Of course, I'm talking about the Theist, the Jagged, the Asathanai, and some others I'm just not bringing. There is a plot in Kharkanas, with subplots and all that. It's not that the plot has been neglected, it's that the plot takes the back seat, and in the front seat of the proverbial car, in the front seat it's theme and character who are writing. There are certainly character arcs in Kharkanas, but I would argue that Kharkanas make an extremely solid argument for the fact that you can still explore the human condition without the character growth. This doesn't imply that the book argues that change is impossible. That's an entirely different debate. But even if change is possible, it doesn't mean that everybody changes. And you can still explore a lot by showing people that don't manage to ever change. You can still learn from exploring how people try to change and don't manage to. And from a diegetic perspective, it makes sense. I mean, imagine a 3,000 years old Jagged. You really expect them to change in 2 months? Doesn't make a lot of sense. As we get older, it becomes harder for us to grow. Some argue, I'm not getting on that discussion, but some argue that after a certain age, we simply cannot change for the most part. But there's still value in exploring these aspects. And I think Kharkanas make an excellent argument for that. And sure enough, we get to the subversions. The characters that we find here in this book, that were in the Book of the Fallen and we most likely adored or hated, depending on which it is, they seem to be morphed. The ones we love or admire seem either unremarkable or, I'll have to put it that way, despicable. Yes, Anomander is really underwhelming. Envy and Spite, 2 characters I really love in the Book of the Fallen, become completely unbearable in these books. Not because they are poorly written, but because you see where they come from. And when you read it, it makes sense that they were like that those many thousands of years in the Book of the Fallen. The ones one hates in the Book of the Fallen seem to get new layers of complexities. Osirk, Olor Ethel, Kilmandaros, although in the case of Kilmandaros, I always like her. Even in the Book of the Fallen, and even if she was doing things that weren't particularly cool, I always liked the character. But here, all these people seem to get new layers of meaning. I mean, even the supposed antagonists of the book. Yeah, they are assholes, but they have such a complex net of motivations, so very well defined circumstances they are victims of, that we can kind of get where they are coming from. This clearly doesn't excuse the atrocities that go on in Kharkanas executed by those people. It doesn't excuse them, but yes, you can hate them, but it's not that easy to hate them. You still hate them, but it is not fun. The elephant in the room is the fact that the historiographies don't match. The historiography of Kamenson and the historiography of Galland disagree on glaring, obvious ways. These are huge points. As in, look, this very important person is not actually the son of who you thought they were the sons of. This character is not of the race that you're supposed to think they are. By this time, this hadn't happened, although you supposedly think that's the case. And one may say that what's going on, what happened? But that's precisely the point. Again, quoting, abandon any hope for absolute certainty, ye who enter hears. It's to abandon certainty and to just read what Galland has to say. And then we have the use of the anticlimax that is used abundantly. And I think for good reasons. The anticlimax has a very specific effect on our psyche. I think not in vain many of the tragedies of older works were in fact anticlimactic. In the end, nobody can challenge our own expectations. We question ourselves from the inside, and it is only from the inside that true change can happen. Only from the inside. Only ourselves can challenge our own expectations, our own belief systems. Outside sources can incite, provoke, suggest, influence. But only that. And what I will argue is that that's what Kharkanas does best. Incite, influence, suggest, provoke. This will explain, I believe, what the reception of the series of the trilogy has been, even for hardcore Molassan fans. If you don't find yourself in the position to accept this challenge on yourself, on your system, on your expectations, it won't be very effective. You will probably hate it because you wanted to get a certain content and you didn't get it. Not at all. It's really easy to reject all this, to say, bah, Erickson just went crazy and either forgot everything he wrote or just decided to start anew or something like that. It's easy to fall into that set of mind if one isn't open to re-examine our expectations and why they are there. Here I must add that this is not a value judgment, it's just a description of fact. I'm not saying that if you want to read something particularly after you finish the Book of the Fallen, there's nothing wrong with that. But Kharkanas is what it is. It's not designed to cater to what you want after you finish the Book of the Fallen. And if you're coming to it with an open mind, I can assure you that it will be really satisfying. But it's not wrong if that's not what you're going for. This whole discussion is much more about me having an issue with people that assert a certain norm. If you are clear about the fact that that's a preference and not a norm, I'm fine with that. So I guess there's a nuance about all this argument. In general, if we in criticism or commentary, if we were more honest about what is an opinion and what is a value judgment and an attempt at an objective evaluation of a piece of work, I think we will save ourselves a lot of energy discussing and debating. One might argue that that's just semantics. Well, kind of, because I do think that words have meaning, words bring nuance, and that's important for communication anyways. I myself, in this channel and anywhere I write, I try to dispense with any notion of an attempt at objective ranking of anything. What I'm discussing here is what I like. I'm not doing any attempt at validate my opinion as something objective. We need to acknowledge that one can hate a book without the book being a piece of garbage, and that we can love forms of art that aren't particularly great. Sadly, in the tradition I just described at the beginning of this rant, that has just disappeared. Nowadays, if I don't like something, it's because obviously it's hot garbage. And if I like something, it must obviously be the epitome of art, of literature. This is something I don't think is going to change, but I do believe that if we acknowledge that, things will improve a lot discussing this kind of topic. But finally, summing all this up, the point is that the Kharkanas Trilogy is the boldest, most clever, touching and refreshing endeavor of narrative creativity that I have seen in a while. It is already one of my favorite series in fiction. I am one of the 63 fans that is eagerly awaiting for Walk in Shadow to come out. But my point is a bit deeper. Even if you don't like, not if you don't like, but even if you don't prefer this kind of work, and even if I myself didn't prefer this kind of trilogy, I think there's an argument to be made to the fact that we have a certain compromise in supporting works of art that are, without a doubt, expanding the horizons of the general narrative field that we love. This might be blasphemy, but take Dune. I came to fantasy from science fiction. I could never get into Dune. I understand what is praised, but I don't like Dune. I couldn't get into it. But I still think, of course, I was born way after Dune was first published. My support is not that necessary, but Dune is absolutely the type of work that I would have supported, even though I didn't love it, because I could see how it did it. It was expanding the genre that I love. I think at one point one has a moral obligation of standing by forms of art that are actually pushing the boundaries of what can be done and what can't. And Kharkanas is one of those, in my opinion. This kind of creative risk, it deserves our support. Even if you weren't a fan of what Erickson did from the Book of the Fallen to Kharkanas, what I'm saying is that Kharkanas deserves that support. Erickson deserves that support for being willing to risk his next release with what he did. It would be easy to what? Take Carson, make a trilogy. By then the Witness trilogy will have been finished. To take the Marines, Quickband, one of the others, and expand on them. Those are easy. It's clear that the community loves those guys. They will buy anything with those names. Trying to be creative, trying to take the works of Shakespeare and mimicking the narrative effects they have, while also trying to modernize them. That's without a doubt a risk. And I think that means something. As for myself, Toll the Hounds and The Crippled God are just too emotionally impactful. But if it wasn't for those two books, Kharkanas, in my opinion, will be the greatest thing Erickson ever wrote. I was a fan of Memories of Ice and of the Bone Hunters. But I think Kharkanas is on a whole new level compared to that.